Wednesday morning. Let's get you caught up on the big stories of the week. We have New York Times White House correspondent Maggie Haberman and New York Times White House reporter Jonathan Swan. They are co-authors of the new book titled Regime Change: Inside the Imperial Presidency of Donald Trump. And what a book it is.
It's incredible.
Spent the last week reading it, and it really kind of encapsulates everything.
Well, and you know, the thing about it is, Maggie, and we talked about this before the book, talking about it, a lot of these books will have like 5 or 6 stories that people will gasp about, and they'll make big headlines, and it's good reporting. But this is sort of, it's more thematic. It's not just sort of a, look, well, this happened in the White House on this date, and isn't this shocking? You read through it and you start picking up these themes, and you actually start putting your arms around all the chaos of the first year.
Yeah, one of the things that really struck us as we were reporting this book, and this book took us an enormous amount of effort. To quote my colleague, no, we're not in Fallujah, but this was a lot of hard work, because this is a different White House, really unrecognizable in so many ways to the first term. And one of those ways is they do try to keep information from getting out. They do have this sort of bubble of information around them. You know this well, much more than before. And so this was a huge, intensive effort to show readers and take you inside how this government works. Not just, here was this moment, here is something that happened. But if you want to understand how this administration is functioning, if you want to understand how decisions are made, if you want to understand this small group of people who are running this government and what this could mean going forward, this is, I think, the best effort that you can have right now. It's obviously the first draft of history. There will be much more to be written about this period, but you do see that it is a White House that is much more invested in him. It is an administration that is much more invested in him than in term one. He is operating on gut instinct in a way that surpasses really anything that we saw in his first term. And a lot of what we've seen is some of what he was hoping to do in term one. But it is a story of hubris and buying into the idea that this one person actually could do things that nobody else could, and you are sort of seeing the bill coming due for that right now in Iran.
It's a story of, Jonathan, that you guys tell of really no process in so many major decisions. And I could name 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 examples of him just going through and just throwing numbers off the top of his head for tariffs, or just making decisions that people are like, wait, what did he do? What did he say? What are we... But the best example of it was when he decided to jack tariffs up to 125% against China. Then China, she just sat there and said, okay, no rare earth minerals for you, no magnets, no this, no that. And Trump panics, and he goes, okay, we got to do something about it. What did we put the rate at? And somebody said 125%, sir. He goes, holy shit! Like, he didn't remember. And that's just one example. For people saying, oh, you're just picking that. No, it happens time and time again where he just, like, it's all from the gut. There's no process. And again, that's why we go into Iran when any expert would have told him not to do that.
Well, it's 2 things. So on the tariff situation, it's a great example because this is something he's thought about for years, talked about trade. You know, it's this thing he's sort of had, but never really had a developed economic theory of how this would work.
But he has believed in this. And
for sure.
Since like
for
1988,
sure.
1989.
But at a sort of gut, fairly superficial level. And was always restrained in term one. You had people like Gary Cohn saying, no, this is terrible. He did some tariffs. They were fairly targeted and narrow. But there was a meeting early on where they're talking about tariffs on Mexico and Canada. And Trump says, what are we doing for China? And someone says, you know, we should probably do some analysis. And he says, put them in for 10. Put them in for 10.
Like last minute.
Put them in for 10. That's literally a quote in the Oval Office meeting. And of course, then, Xi Jinping did not back down. He had prepared Xi Jinping had prepared very deliberately for this Trump term, and it ratcheted up and up and up. And before he knew it, he was in a massive trade war with essentially an embargo against China.
So Maggie, I mean, you have covered Donald Trump closely for many, many years. You're talking about some of the difference between the first term and the second term. We see them, the public sees them out in the open, just beginning with the people he surrounds himself with, that Fox News hosts have big and important jobs. But from your point of view, from the inside, just how different is this time around from the first term?
This is a group of people who genuinely believe in him. These are people who, in many ways, got radicalized by the investigations into him, by the assassination attempts that he faced. Watching him he's the first sitting president who in the U.S. who is a convicted felon, and he is still obviously trying to get that appealed, but they were in these court fights with him, and watching him still win, and watching him win overwhelmingly, and watching their data prove to be right, basically informed their view of how they were going to function, which is A, he was denied things that he wanted last time by people who either saw him as dangerous or at least in need of being curbed in some way. And remember, he had never run for city council, much less president. He wins on the first shot. He has no familiarity with the federal government outside of lobbying for, contracts or lobbying for grant funding or things like that. And he expects the world to function kind of like a municipal government, right? And that is what he knows in New York. He didn't know most of his government last time. He didn't know most of his White House last time. And so, as Jonathan said, he actually, this trade war is something he has wanted to try for a long time. It is true that he has talked about tariffs for decades, but what that looked like beyond just a blunt instrument was not clear to anybody. They are letting him do things because the theory is, I shouldn't say letting, he's the president, and their theory is he can do what he wants and that he should get to do what he wants. What ends up happening is something like how we got to Iran, which we describe in detail in the book, both the 12-day war and how that worked last year, and then the lead up to the February 28th strike, which really was the president wanting to do this. There really were close to none. Pete Hegseth was really the closest in terms of thinking this was something that should be done. But Trump was told over and over again inside his government, here is what could happen. Dan Kane laid out, here are the scenarios. He was told by the CIA director and his national security advisor, Marco Rubio, and Secretary of State, that these regime change scenarios that Bibi Netanyahu had presented in the Situation Room of the White House, and we took readers inside there, that these scenarios were farcical. Rubio took it further, said they were bullshit. Didn't mean that nothing could be accomplished, but Trump just, heard it, and he wanted to go ahead. And he was very clear with people he spoke to that he believed it would be okay because things always are. And here we are.
Comparing the terms, the one thing that I noticed before Donald Trump got into politics, and I would go to Mar-a-Lago to have a meeting with him, I noticed he never sat down. He always go table to table to table. How's your food? What's your da-da-da? What can I do for you? Is your room okay? And I always told people when he started getting into politics, he was the ultimate concierge. He just was. And what I found in your book is, because we all ask the question, does he have this much power over Republicans? You go into great detail about him learning the lessons between the first and second term. And he just showered members of Congress with all this attention. Tim Burchett said, telling reporters, he knows my name. I'm just so flattered he knows my name. Constantly calling him, constantly bringing him over to a point where you write, and this jumped off the page, on 211, you write, Trump wielded near total command over his party in Congress, command greater than any president before him.
Well, we tried to find any president where you could compare it for their own party in Congress. I defy you to tell me one where you can convince these guys, many of whom absolutely knew or felt that Pete Hegseth, Tulsi Gabbard, Bobby Kennedy were all, and this is in the views of quite a number of Republican senators, grossly unfit for office, and yet they just did it anyway. There were people who really didn't want to vote for his legislation, cut Medicaid in their districts and states. Huge problems. He got
They do it
through
anyway.
They
And
do
you
it
bring
anyway.
up the point of Joni Ernst wanted to vote against Hegseth.
She saw her political life.
Crushed.
Absolutely.
They went after her and crushed her.
There's two options, really. There's two options. You go along with it.
Fall in line.
Or you get crushed.
Right.
And they are open about that. I mean, Chris LaCivita, one of his operatives, said, I can't remember, you might remember the exact quote.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was on the record. It was essentially that the iron fist rule that they take with the Republican Party, and if you don't fall in line, you get your effing head bashed in.
But it's this. They see it as a virtuous cycle, because what actually happens is fear raises money that generates more fear. Mm-hmm. So corporate America's terrified of him. So they go out and they say, hey guys, we need some money. Right? Mm-hmm. So all these companies give money. They build up their political war chest. Thomas Massey in Congress says, I'm not going to support this. They say, OK, the hammer's coming down. What's happened to Thomas Massey? He's out of Congress.
We're going to read from the book the exchange that Maggie described, just to frame it out a little bit more. It's on page 411. You both asked Trump if there's ever been an American president as powerful as he is now. And he told you a story about recently attending an event honoring golfer Gary Player, where another man who he described as a historian gave the following assessment of Trump. Quote, he began reading from it, reciting names from some of history's most powerful figures, explaining how each fell short of his own power as U.S. president. Alexander the Great, the Caesars, William the Conqueror, Genghis Khan, Attila the Hun, Tamerlane, Napoleon, he said, with relish, Hitler, Mao, Stalin. Trump lingered on the document's central argument that each leader, however fearsome in his day, had no global reach. Their power was local, but his was not. And a White House aide later texted you stating that the historian Trump mentioned was actually Gary Player's caddy and confidant who had long been fascinated with history, and he gave Trump this assessment in person, then wrote it up and sent it to the White House.
Caddy historian, 6 to 1.
We're going to continue this conversation with Jonathan and Maggie after a break. There is a lot more to talk about.
With Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan. Maggie, there's been so much reporting out of the book already about the Trump administration's handling of the Epstein files, but I think it's worth kind of digging into it a little bit for people who haven't fully read through it. And the fact that the Situation Room was used as a place to have these highly sensitive meetings about how to handle this issue. And you get into a very specific meeting on July 17th, 2025, Trump officials getting into that secure bunker. The level of panic that they had because Donald Trump did not want the word Epstein ever mentioned again around the White House. How did that meeting play out? And who were the leading voices saying, we got to put this stuff out? And who were the ones saying, we can't, he won't let us?
Yeah, so just to set the scene here a bit, Willie, what happens shortly before, like 2 days, I think, or 4 days before that meeting, is they pass his one big legislative accomplishment last year, which was the One Big Beautiful Bill. They put all of their political capital into getting this done. And can they go out and start talking about that, the White House comms team or senior staff? No. This is where the energy goes, which is dealing with a crisis that has now exploded. A, it was self-inflicted. B, it became much worse after the DOJ and the FBI released this unsigned memo. It just had their insignias on it. Initially, some draft didn't even have that, according to our reporting, because nobody really wanted their name on this. And this was essentially something that some of the hardest line voices in Trump's government, who had spent years talking about Epstein and talking about Trump to be.
By the way, the unsigned memo said they weren't going to release anything else, right?
Yes, it said that. Well, it said they had looked. They hadn't actually released really anything yet, other than Pam Bondi's binders, which was months earlier, and we can talk about that as
recycled information.
Yeah, as a huge. It was almost all old information, but that was seen as the original blunder inside the White House. There were people in Trump's government who had spent years talking publicly about how there is this cabal of predators, and the government was sitting on this. And to be clear, there is a multi-administration failure in terms of dealing with the Epstein crisis. That's definitely true, or dealing with Epstein and prosecution. But they get in power, and they're serving a president who actually does not want to talk about this at all. He has been told that his name is in some of the files, that it's brief mentions. DOJ didn't exactly know what was there in full. They put out something to satisfy the base. It satisfies no one. It's got a missing minute from Epstein's prison cell in the video that they put out along with it. So this meeting comes to try to figure out how to deal with something they cannot get away with and that Donald Trump keeps getting asked about it. The problem for them is the president doesn't want to hear Epstein. He would snap the name. He would snap at anybody who would bring it up. And so they had several meetings in the Situation Room. We capture just a few of them. And the ones that we capture were almost exclusively about how to handle this in a way that deals with their boss.
That protects him?
That doesn't stoke further conspiracies, that doesn't hurt themselves, frankly, politically. So we describe, this is a huge meeting, this first one that we describe. It's the vice president. It is the White House chief of staff. It is the attorney general, the deputy attorney general, White House counsel, comms officials. I mean, the list is long. And they are talking about what to do now because this memo has just created such a stir. And one of the officials there, Deputy White House Chief of Staff James Blair, says something to the effect of, with all due respect, it's the comm strategy of this group that got us into this. And, there needs to be an actual plan here on how to get out of this. J.D. Vance, the whole time, wanted to release everything, including unsubstantiated information about Donald Trump, which was
abusing a woman.
There was a second-hand allegation that was, I want to be clear, already public.
Right.
Yes.
And I want to be clear, too, that I'm not saying he abused a woman. What I'm saying is what shocked me was that J.D. Vance had this unsubstantiated charge of Donald Trump abusing a minor and told Susie Wiles in the group, in your book, told Susie Wiles in the group, oh, we need to release it all. He'll be fine releasing it. And Susie Wiles said, no, he won't.
Yeah.
And that's just one of the moments of many where J.D. Vance seems to be strangely disconnected from Donald Trump inside this book.
Just one thing. It was that specific incident, which, again, was a secondhand allegation that was never, and it was already
never
public. And it was, yes, and the person who it was about never said it themselves. And it was public already. It was just, would you put it on this big library of information? And this person, as far as we know, was not a minor. We don't know that, but I don't know one way.
But again, J.D. Vance is saying, put it out.
Yes, and there's just nothing that any of us know about Donald Trump that would suggest that he would want to steer people's attention to it. There certainly were, everything is not black and white in all of this. There were, as I said, a number of meetings. There were people who were concerned about the victims. Pam Bondi was concerned about people being aware of how much child pornography there was. There were people in the White House who were concerned about not hurting the victims more. But that was not the focus, primary focus of these meetings. This was about how to deal with a political crisis. And they were holding these meetings in the White House Situation Room to avoid leaks. That was the point.
In spaces where wars are planned and executed, and the bin Laden raid and everything else. Jonathan, the Epstein files are foundational to much of the MAGA base, to conservative voters, to podcasters. They've been talking about it for years and years and years. So with that in mind, and I know this isn't a book about the Epstein files, there's a lot more to be said, but what is your sense of why Donald Trump is so uniquely sensitive about the Epstein files? Why he was pushing not to have this stuff released? Why, as Maggie says, you couldn't even mention the word Epstein in the White House, certainly around him? What is it about him and the Epstein files?
I think there's an obvious reason and a less obvious reason. The obvious reason is he's mentioned, as the New York Times said, more than 38,000 times in the Epstein files. Him, his family, Mar-a-Lago. Jeffrey Epstein's obviously, one of the most notorious pedophiles, sex predators, is a monster of history. Trump fell out with him. Various reasons have been given, but he obviously had a very close friendship with him, and there's numerous photos of them hanging out together, videos of them partying together. So it's not a good look, to state the very minimum. There's another reason which I think is also very powerful, which is Trump is so used to being able to tell the base, do this, think this, here's where I need you to run, and the base runs. And this was the first time I've seen, I could make an argument a little bit on the vaccines. I saw him get booed when he praised COVID vaccines. That was a moment when he was out with us. But this was a time when he was saying, guys, don't look over here, look over here. This is a hoax. And they just said, no, we're going to keep looking over here.
All right, we're going to continue our deep dive into the new book, Regime Change, Inside the Imperial Presidency of Donald Trump, with Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan in just a moment. We're going to take a look after the break at some of the other players that you covered.
People are trying to figure out who's going to replace Donald Trump, who's his heir apparent. Is it going to be J.D.? Is it going to be Marco? You read this book, and he seems to have a great relationship with Marco Rubio. There's this moment where somebody's looking at all the gold that he's fixed all over the Oval Office. They said, "Aren't you worried the next president's going to take it all down?" He said, "Nah, Cubans love gold."
Who could he be talking about?
Who could he be talking about? But you all suggest he's really comfortable with Marco in a way he's not comfortable with J.D.
He has personal chemistry with Marco Rubio in a way which is fascinating, given where they were in 2016 and what we all watched. And he does.
Why is that? Do you know why?
I don't think I can point to it, but for whatever reason, there is just more of a specific rapport. He does like Vance, to be clear. Mm-hmm. They do get along. They do have a good relationship. But for whatever reason, in this iteration, he and Rubio have done well together. We have this scene in the book where at a dinner a few months after Trump and Rupert Murdoch, go to war essentially over an Epstein-related story in the Wall Street Journal, that a phalanx of Murdoch world people and Murdoch come to dinner at the White House. This is mid-October, and it was seen widely inside the administration as something of an effort at a thaw. But in this, it's a big dinner. There were a lot of people there. And J.D. Vance was there, his wife was there, Marco Rubio was there. And in front of the two of them, Trump starts engaging in one of his favorite games that he has always done, which is essentially turn people into contestants. And he asks Murdoch, who everyone at the table knew did not want Vance to be the vice presidential choice. He says, "What do you think of J.D.?" And he says, "Well, J.D. has, the potential to be great," I think is the quote. And then, sort of an uncomfortable laugh. And J.D. says, "Thanks a lot, Rupert." and Trump says, "What do you think of Marco?" And Murdoch, just sort of cold as ice, which for those of us who have worked for a Murdoch publication know well, is his way. He just says, Marco is brilliant. And it left a very clear impression of where Murdoch would like to be, but it was a reminder of what Trump puts people through in order to earn his favor. And that was certainly, we didn't end up putting this in the book, and there was a lot of reporting on it at the time too, but what he put everyone through in terms of the Veep stakes, the people who wanted to be on the ticket with him, was a really extended version of this. And so I anticipate we will see a lot of this going forward. We also don't have anything in our reporting that suggests that Rubio is actually running. He's not taking steps that one would take. Doesn't mean he won't. He could obviously do that fairly quickly. But for now, there's no reason to think that Vance is not the front runner, and that if Vance remains the front runner, that Trump will go along and not undercut him completely. But we'll see.
Before we went to the break, you were leading up to a major inflection point in this presidency, and that would be the killing of Renee Good and Alex Preddy. And there are still a lot of questions as to where those investigations stand as the government took them over. And I believe at least one of those ICE officers are back at work. Due process for migrants or for people on American soil or U.S. citizens getting swept up, children being held in detention centers for many, many months, people,
Good morning. Let's get you caught up on the big stories of the...
And many are asking, how could this happen? How could so much of our laws and policies and regulations break down? And I think you attempt to answer this question in this book on many levels, whether it's immigration or how we're treating Ukraine. Explain how so much can happen without it being answered. And I know the courts are pushing back, but still, there's so much. It's almost like you can't keep up with all the, just on immigration alone, with case by case by case by case by case cruelty and illegal actions.
Well, so what you're talking about is accountability and mechanisms to stop them acting. And I think what you raise is really important in terms of the facts on the ground outpacing the legal system. The legal system was not built for someone like Donald Trump. It just wasn't. Take the early days of Doge. They shut down USAID, a whole agency established in statute by Congress for foreign aid. And by the time the system kind of woke up and put its socks on, it's over. It's done.
Right.
That is the one thing. If you look the first 6 months, you do have the courts, the universities, everybody's scrambling.
Right.
It seems as you get to the second half of your book, the system has awakened. The judges have awakened. They are sort of on their front foot now.
Yes, but so one thing we have in the book is, last spring, Trump and Stephen Miller Stephen Miller explicitly, Trump in a more alluding way, talked about contemplating suspending habeas corpus, right? Habeas rights, the rights to appeal your detention. If you get locked up,
Right.
Some right to appeal it. They wanted to get rid of that for illegal immigrants. And we thought this is a really important, you're talking about sort of one of the most foundational rights you have.
As you say, a concept that goes back before the Magna Carta.
Predates the Constitution. This is one of the most
And the
fundamental.
Magna Carta, yeah.
When you get locked up, you get to appeal. That's one of the most fundamental rights. This was far more seriously entertained than people realized at the time. And we obtained secret memos that the staff secretary of the White House, Will Scharf, wrote to Susie Wiles in very lawyerly language, but basically laying out why this was a line that the White House should not cross. So they don't suspend habeas corpus, but in a certain way, like, habeas rights have been suspended because there are, thousands of immigrants who are in detention centres
waiting,
who are not getting hearings and languishing there. And we have, there are people who are charting this, other reporters who are charting this more rigorous, in a more comprehensive way than we are, but they're ignoring court orders.
अंधेरी दीवारों में खुद को ढूंढता हूँ गए जो दिन सहाने थे उन्हीं को सोचता हूँ मैं तुम्हारे बिन ये मौसम भी बड़ा बेसर्द लगता है दिल का हर एक कोना अब बहुत ही दूर भरता है अंधेरी दीवारों में खुद को ढूंढता हूँ मैं ये जो दिन सुहाने थे उन्हीं को सोचता हूँ मैं तुम्हारे बिन ये मौसम भी बड़ा सर्द लगता है दिल का हर एक कोना बहुत ही दर्द भरता है मेरे साए भी मुझसे अब जुदा होने को कहते हैं तुझे खोने की राहों में ये आंसू बहने लगते हैं कहाँ जाऊं कहाँ ढूंढूं मेरा वो साजो सामा तो मेरी हर एक तमन्ना तू मेरी रूह का मका तू लकीरों में नहीं लिखा जो तुमने ख्वाब देखा था वफा की इस कहानी में फकत एक गम ही लिखा था सितारों से भी पूछता है पता तेरा कहाँ होगा मगर खामोश है दुनिया कहाँ मेरा जहाँ होगा बस एक बार मुड़ के देख ले मेरी बेबसी की सूरत मुझे है आज भी तेरी वफा की सख्त जरूरत बस रह गया दर्द का असर हंसाए मेरे तन्हा सफर बस रह गया दर्द का असर